welcome to another Jono Talks podcast. Today I have Jude Joseph with me, and we will be discussing the upcoming federal election, which commences on Saturday, only a few days away. And we'll also be talking about the American situation with Donald Trump and how he's likely to be the president of the United States, which is perhaps a scary thought for everyone. But Jude's involved with the anti-fascist and anarchist movements, respectively. And one of the interesting things about the anarchist movement is the fact that one of the ideals is that you don't believe in a government per se. But before the podcast, Jude, you mentioned to me that the Greens Party, you would probably be voting for them. But isn't that in conflict with the ideal of the anarchist movement, which is not to support a government in the first place?
That's a really interesting topic that a lot of anarchists, I think, have different approaches to. So, basically, there are a lot of anarchists who refuse to vote flat out because of that exact thing. It's a contradiction to vote for a government when you don't believe there should be a government in the first place. But the problem is with that, with compulsory voting, it's pretty much a case of either cast your vote to the most favourable out of all of them, or pretty much if you leave it to the people who want to vote, then you'll only be having conservative parties enter, and will probably be a lot worse for wear. So I figure voting for, it's kind of like a lesser of two evils situation, or a lesser of three evils, I guess.
Yeah, so you can't have it all your own way. Like, because it's compulsory voting, I mean, you have to vote. You can't necessarily vote for an anarchist movement, or can you?
No, not in Australia that I'm aware of. I don't think we have an anarchist party. There are other countries, but
it exists overseas?
Yeah, I think Greece had quite a prominent one. There are a lot of countries, mostly in Europe, where you'll find anarchist parties, which is another sort of contradiction in its own right, I guess.
Yeah, it is, because you're voting for a party which believes in a non-government. Like, I just think it's an interesting topic. But why will you vote for the Greens?
Basically, I think that their policies are the most in line with an anarchist perspective out of any of the ones that you could vote for, unless you put your vote to one of the really minor parties. So I don't necessarily 100% support the Greens on all fronts, but I think if I want a society anywhere close to the ideal one in my mind, then I think that's the best way to vote.
I mean, in general, the Greens Party is quite radical in its approach. I got a letter from, we're both from the area of Higgins, our electorate, which is traditionally a coalition-favoured area. In the polls, though, it's showing that it could be a lot closer than history results can be accounted for, which is interesting. And I got a letter from the Greens Party introducing himself, which also leads to the idea of, advertising in politics. I mean, advertising is such a crucial and necessary medium for political parties, because the fact is that not a lot of people care about politics. The fact that you and I are sitting here discussing about politics, I mean, I asked some of my friends if they wanted to come on. They didn't really know too much about it. And some people, just because of the compulsory voting system we have in Australia, they just vote for a party which they don't necessarily believe in or know little about, or they just, are led by the advertising. They might like a certain policy that someone's implementing. Trump, as a businessman in America, he's running for president now for the Republican Party, but I mean, he would have used a lot of advertising in America to gather the support of people. And it's incredible. I mean, there's a poll which suggests that 34% of Americans trust in Trump to be the president of the United States. Do you have any opinions on that whole situation?
I've got a lot of opinions. Well, for one thing, yeah, that's definitely a problem. I think you'd find, like you were saying, the majority of voters in any country, in America or Australia, in a democratic country, the majority of voters tend to be like fence sitters, quite apathetic. And so I think the problem with political advertising is it kind of just it takes something away from what the democracy idea is meant to be, because it kind of becomes a case of if you have more money, you have more of a chance of winning, because people seem to be quite easily influenced. And so you get someone like Donald Trump, who's got billions of dollars, and he's got 34% of votes coming his way by the looks of it. So, yeah, it's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't understand why. I mean, the whole reason why this situation has presented itself in the first place is the fact that Obama can't serve out another term based on the legislature in the United States of America, which I find both troublesome but also necessary, in the sense that I don't think it's a good thing to have an American president serve out 20 years or more. I think it's necessary to, renew the president. I know there's some differing opinions on that as well. But someone with like Obama, who's just legalized same-sex marriage in America, well, he didn't legalize it, but the High Court did. And one of the reasons why was because Obama was, really influencing that. And you look at the contrast here in Australia, one party, I mean, we haven't endorsed same-sex marriage yet. It hasn't been made as a policy by the coalition party, whereas Obama has done some things in America which have been really great for society in general to look at America and say they're making advancements. I mean, I just find it weird how, Donald Trump could be the president of America, not necessarily because he couldn't do a competent job. I mean, he must be intelligent to run for president. It's just about like what type of president do you want? You don't really want a businessman who has had little experience with politics in the past. Whereas, Obama's done such a good job, in my opinion. And so I don't see why he can't stay on for another term. I think that would be, I mean, just from a, presentation standpoint, I mean, he's one of the best orators that we've ever seen as a president. The way he speaks, like his speeches, he's very articulate. And when you see someone like Trump speak, it's very advertising-like in its approach. And I guess that a lot of political parties have to do that, not just Trump, just to garner votes of the public. Because like you said, a lot of people have apathy towards voting. They don't want to vote. And one of the big things is that America doesn't adopt compulsory voting, because they have a bigger population. So it makes me wonder, should Australia adopt compulsory voting, in the future?
Well, yeah, I don't know. Like,
or it should not adopt.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's a really good argument you could make for either side of compulsory voting. Because on the one hand, like I said before, you kind of just open the gateway for only conservative votes to be cast. But at the same time, even with compulsory voting, it kind of just, I think if you talk to most people in our generation, they'll just tell you that they're voting for the sex party, even though they don't have any idea what the sex party's policies are like. Not that I really do either, but it's just quite dangerous. Like, donkey votes are an actual threat to society.
And On the other hand, though, it might not be a threat to donkey vote if, like, your electorate per se is like there's a leading party that you know who's going to win. I think it's more the marginal seats, which in Australia at least, that's what decides the Prime Minister. Like those marginal seats which can swing either way. And at the moment, statistically speaking, the coalition has the edge. But, I mean, that could swing around come election time. That's always confused me sometimes, like the polling they get before the election, because I don't like receive calls from any survey saying, you know, which party are you going to vote for, Jonathan or my mother or my father? Or at least they haven't told me. So it's like, how do they get this sample of voters and extrapolate it out into the whole area? It's always baffled me because I've never has a survey ever called you and said before the election, what party are you going to go for? What policy do you support?
No, I've never had any of that. So, yeah, that's a good point. I'm not entirely sure how they get their data.
Yeah,
It'd definitely be questioned.
Yeah. I'm sure it's done, you know, all in good vein, but I mean, you have to extrapolate it. I mean, you can't interview everyone because, you know, with the reports and the polling, I mean, they obviously get a small percentage of certain voters and extrapolate it to make a whole percentage. So even though the coalition is winning on the marginal seats, statistically, it could be different come election time. And that's why, like you said, it's important to actually have some idea of who you're voting for, because if you don't, then you're really not participating in the democratic process of politics and voting for who you support. I mean, one reason why the coalition, why I won't be supporting the coalition, is due to the plebiscite idea on same-sex marriage. That in of itself will cost over $100 million. On the flip side of that, one could argue that a plebiscite puts an exclamation mark on the issue that once a vote is in, there can be no ifs or buts. Same-sex marriage is either legalized or it isn't. Do you want to see a plebiscite on same-sex marriage?
No, I think the plebiscite is quite a silly idea. We heard before the last election, well, not even election, but Turnbull's statements regarding marriage equality were very sort of endorsing it. He was very passionately saying, I believe in same-sex marriage, and if I'm made Prime Minister, I will make it, my goal for it to be legalised. So if he wanted to follow through on that, I think that the most straightforward way to do it would have just been to do it. I don't think a plebiscite's really all that necessary. And like you said, it's kind of just a waste of money.
Because the vote's already out there in one aspect. But you just mentioned Turnbull here, and you're correct. I mean, he does support same-sex marriage. It's just really what that policy is doing is delaying the inevitable in a way. But it's also because Turnbull is a relatively new Prime Minister in the scheme of things, taking over from Abbott more than a couple of months ago. Was it like 4 or 5 months ago now? But the fact is that he's governed by the party's values as well. So he can't just stamp his... I'm sure if he was... I'm just guessing here, but if he was just voting... If he was just putting forth a policy on same-sex marriage without a party, he'd probably just legalize it. But because he's got to make an agreement with his fellow party members, it's crucial to make a collective agreement. So some people like to portion the blame of the idea of a plebiscite on Turnbull, but I think that's slightly flawed because, like you said, he actually does support same-sex marriage, and you have to wonder how much of that is actually party influenced. I think Labor, they don't support a plebiscite. They would legalise it straight away. And the vote's already out there. Statistically, I think over 65% of Australians want same-sex marriage. But one needs to research, how much extrapolation is put in there, like we were discussing before. Because I've never, it still baffles me. I've never received a call or something just saying, "What do you think about this topic, X and Y?" It'd be interesting just to know how they actually get the results sometimes.
Yeah.
But so yeah, you think it's a waste of money for the economy. From a moral standpoint, I think we can agree that both parties want to see same-sex marriage legalized. I think we've gotten to that point now. Before, I think under Tony Abbott's tenure, there was a bit of reluctance there. And there's the inevitable fact that, some policies can be governed by religious views per se.
Mm-hmm.
In America, unless there's not a lot of politicians that have come out as atheists. A lot say that they're believers in God. And hopefully we get to a point that everyone, can freely disclose their beliefs. Because at the moment, it can be ridiculed. But it's good that we're progressing in that regard. Do you think Turnbull's doing a good job overall, though, for Australia? He presents better than Tony Abbott.
He does present better than Tony Abbott. I remember in high school we had a very politically charged classmate, and he wanted to become a politician. And when Malcolm Turnbull got into power, he was very elated. He's a left-wing person. In fact, I think he was gay himself. And I just remember telling him, that this isn't really going to make much change. We've still got the Liberal Party in power. Malcolm Turnbull's not exactly that much different to Tony Abbott, besides a much more charming smile. And sure enough, I don't know. We haven't really seen much better policy coming from Turnbull. I think we've still got a very conservative and right-wing government.
Yeah. Some would say, though, it's pushing more towards the left now. And one of the reasons why is because Australians generally have that, there's more of a progressive need in society to progress with certain issues, such as same-sex marriage, such as asylum seekers. Manus Island was ruled by the High Court to be illegal. And what are we going to do with asylum seekers later on? Are we actually going to provide them with, safe refuge in Australia, or are we going to keep persisting with Manus Island? Are you uncomfortable with the idea of persisting with Manus Island in the future for asylum seekers?
I'm very uncomfortable with it. That's one of my key issues with Malcolm Turnbull, actually, and the Liberal Party, is they just seem to have no regard for what is actually going on there. I think it was under Abbott when the legislation was passed that journalists and medical practitioners who go to Nauru or Manus Island can't disclose what they saw there. And if they do, they can face up to 2 years in jail. The Border Force Act, it's all incredibly inhumane. And, one has to wonder what they have to hide. But, what purpose would there be for keeping journalists silent unless they had something to hide there? And from what we have seen of it, it's an incredibly inhumane policy to have in place, the offshore processing. So, when the PNG courts ruled it illegal, it seemed like there'd be some change, but it seems like they're still quite dead certain that we won't be letting in any refugees. I'm as yet unsure what their plans are. whether they are just going to keep going with it in spite of a blatant court ruling, or whether they're going to find somewhere else to keep them and just keep the same thing going on.
The court ruling, was that in Australia?
No, that was Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, so that's where like Manus Island actually is.
Yeah.
And they, deem that illegal. And there's been, some cases brought out into the media about, just the general conditions there, like you said, like certain injuries. People just don't like. Some people just don't like living there. Asylum seekers, that is. So, and the fact is that it's becoming more and more populated as each week goes by. So it can't be a sustainable thing, one would think. You'd have to find another alternative. The politicians seem to be hesitant at, just welcoming, every asylum seeker back into Australia. I guess, but we have the room though as well. It's not like we don't. I mean, we're not an overpopulated country compared to some others, like China or India. Far from it.
Yeah.
So we definitely have the room, accommodation-wise. The discussion sometimes is geared towards what they can provide to the economy in terms of employment, and making sure that they have safe background checks. But step into someone who is an actual asylum seeker, their first port of call will be just to engineer safety for their family, pretty much. So they're not really thinking about what they can provide to Australia per se. I wouldn't have thought. It'd be more geared towards, how can we provide a better life for our family? And I can always sympathise with that, because I'm not sure about your parents, Jude, but I mean, my background is in Italy. I was born in Australia, but my grandparents were from Italy, and they migrated. One of the reasons why they migrated from Italy to Australia was because of World War II. And people should have the right to, be safe. I mean, it's not a possible ideal in every sense of the word. Because the world's just not set up like that. Talking about asylum seekers, there's also poverty in Africa. So I think it's more of a discussion of how much inequity you can have in that debate, rather than saying asylum seekers should all come back. No, should all come into Australia with safety, or the fact that all of them should be put into Manus Island. I think something needs to be met in the middle, and we haven't quite found it yet. Are you still of the view though that every single asylum seeker should just come to Australia and find accommodation there?
Ideally, yes, but I also acknowledge that that's quite a radical idea for a lot of people to take on. That's a lot of people to welcome in. So I think if we're going to deal with it in a way that's not letting every single refugee in, I think the least that the government can do is provide decent shelter for them while they're processed, and actually process them, because I know that there was some findings that processing kind of just got put on hold indefinitely for no apparent reason. Yeah, we need at least something more humane to be done while they wait, at the very least. And yeah, if we really want to open our hearts, then we should open our borders.
It's just such I can see how it's a difficult subject though for politicians in general. Just finding like a middle ground and appeasing all the party members, whether they're conservative or progressive. I don't even think Labor fully support the idea that they should welcome back every single asylum seeker. I could be wrong there.
No, you're right.
Oh, okay. What's their policy on that?
I'm not sure what their exact policy is, but they haven't come out in favour of welcoming refugees. I think that's one thing that Labor and Liberal have always been very similar on, even though they like to debate it. I remember last election, it wasn't a case of talking about what's being done with the refugees. It was always a case of talking about what's being done to stop the boats.
Yeah.
Treating it more like a hassle and a burden and just some sort of, random problem to fix rather than acknowledging what's on the boats and what that means that there are boats coming here in the first place.
That's such a great point you raise, because under Tony Abbott's government, that was the key idea, that, the boats would be stopped. In one aspect, this is a good thing, because asylum seekers are not risking their lives. I mean, some have died, right? Actually fleeing their country and trying to get to the Australian borders. But in general, they try to get a better life for their family, for their relatives. And most Australians were in favour of that, I would have thought. Otherwise, I don't think he would have been elected. Did he promise that as an electoral promise?
To stop the boat?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So you would think most Australians would have supported that now. It'd be interesting how much we support it, at the present moment. It seems like there seems to have been a shift in attitude because Manus Island has been deemed illegal now, that we need to find another alternative. I'm just looking at the Labor website now on what they potentially might do. They may restore the UN Refugees Convention. Labor, this is what it says, Labor will reinstate references to the UN Refugees Convention in the Migration Act to reverse the Abbott government's retrograde efforts to undermine international law. Well, that's a bit out of date from the Labor Party there, because it's a Turnbull-led government. But in general, though, the party ideals are the same. Sometimes I don't understand how political parties can just not update their website. It says Abbott government on that particular section. But anyway, so is that something that will influence your vote to the Greens? That's purely that asylum seekers issue?
Yeah, it'll influence a great deal. But I find that with the asylum seeker issue, you are right, there's definitely been a sort of shift in attitudes in Australia. Since Abbott was elected, you'd see a lot more anti-refugee sort of people then than now. But on the flip side, we're seeing a really rapid rise in far-right movements, such as the United Patriots Front and the new street gang, the True Blue Crew, which, yeah. And so, yeah, they have very, very radical ideas. The media calls them far-right, but I prefer to call them what they are, which is fascists. We've got a very similar social movement to what was seen in Germany in the 1930s before the war. And it's really quite worrying. So there's a lot less sort of moderate opposition to refugees, but there's a much stronger radical opposition to refugees and Muslims in the country. And even political parties, we're seeing, the Rise Up Australia party that's trying to get into power. Pauline Hanson's made a return with the One Nation party. So yeah, the right wing is sort of the very far radical right wing is trying to sort of get its foothold, and they're growing in numbers, and it's really interesting to watch pretty much the exact same thing that led to Hitler's rise to power kind of repeat itself in our society. And yeah, there's not really much being done outside of the anti-fascist movements to oppose it.
But how many of them will actually be elected, do you think? Is that a possibility?
In this election, I don't think so. But in the future, it's hard to say. They're definitely gaining their support.
And you would realise that because as you're a part of the anti-fascist movement and you have a vested interest in that, you've been to the rallies, you've seen the protests for and against, I would imagine.
Yeah.
What's that experience like going into one of those rallies?
Well, it's really interesting because you see kind of fluctuating results. So I went out to the rally in Melton, which I think I spoke about last time I was on the podcast. And it was really quite a shock. I'm not sure if they outnumbered us, but it was a very sort of even split and a very fierce conflict. Whereas there was a rally last Sunday outside Parliament, and the anti-fascists outnumbered them by about 100 or so, and they only gathered about 60 people, and they never even really showed their faces. So I think for now we're quite safe. We still have a pretty good hold on the inner city, but it's out those areas in Bendigo and Melton where they seem to actually be quite able to gather their support.
Yeah, and that's where, you'd think a lot of the advertising would be directed towards those types of suburbs. And it's interesting, how one decides on such a political party or movement, whether it's just ingrained from birth or whether it's ingrained from developed thoughts. And it can go both ways a lot of the time. But one of the sympathies I have with, people part of the fascist movement is that maybe that, there's no excuse for potentially, me personally, supporting a policy which won't get enacted, I don't really care, because if the policy won't be enacted, I don't see any potential threat. But the fact that if it's actually implemented, that's when it gets worrying. But aside from that, I'm glad you said that, the anti-fascist movement outweighs the fascist movement in Australia. That's a positive thing in general for society. But you have to have some sympathy for those involved in the fascist movement. Maybe their parents just, had similar views and they didn't really know anything else. There's always two things to look at. So I think, and it just goes back to politics in general, how much you can blame on a certain person rather than the party. We were talking about Turnbull before. He supports same-sex marriage. A lot of people can be quick to target him and to say, why is he endorsing a plebiscite? He could have made that in consultation with his party members. It's similar to how maybe a child, might just have not necessarily that fascist movement ingrained within them, but just the general views and thoughts. And so I have some sympathy for both sides, really. But in general, it's good that the anti-fascist movement outweighs the fascist movement. What kind of policies would they support if they were implemented, the fascist party? Something
you see come up a lot is they tend to incite a lot of violence in their circles, but that's not the policies they would want to influence. Like we saw in Perth, I think just today or yesterday, a petrol bomb outside a mosque and a lot of anti-Islam graffiti out the front. So on a street level, that's what they're bringing in. And in terms of policies, if they were to enter government, is they would close the borders full stop and let in, or not full stop, but they wouldn't let in any Muslims. They would deport all Muslims and refugees and keep pretty much anyone non-white out of the country. It's very white supremacist. It's kind of like...
Wow. I didn't know that went that deep.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, you can kind of understand where that comes from. It's not exactly just people who are evil by nature taking something on. In the society we live in, under capitalism, I think everyone's afraid at some level and very angry. And it's just that people direct it in different ways. And if you're a moderate working class person, you don't have much money, and you're afraid for your family and your economic support. And then you get someone like Blair Cottrell, who's the leader of the UPF, who is very eloquent and a very intelligent person. He very, very scarily reminiscent of Adolf Hitler. He's very good at sort of emotively making you believe that the enemy is Muslims and refugees. And so I can imagine it'd be very easy for those people to get sort of taken in by that. And then from there on, it's like a cult. It's indoctrination and all of that sort of thing. So I think it's largely just the misdirection of anger and fear. So rather than looking at the fact that the government itself, the upper class in a capitalist society, is intrinsically oppressive, that's my opinion anyway, it's them that keep the working class from, prosperity and being able to aspire to anything greater.
When it spreads, doesn't it? Especially when you have someone who speaks well and with eloquence. You talked about Adolf Hitler. The stuff he did to the Jews were just horrible. I think everyone would have learned that in high school, and the gas chamber. I remember going to a one of those museums where they have where you can kind of experience or look at what these people would have had to go through in concentration camps and stuff. And one of them was a survivor, and I was just absolutely blown away with one of his anecdotes. He said he saw a train go past, and he was in a concentration camp, and as the train was going past, it wasn't one he was meant to catch, but he just happened to be near a train, and he was with someone else who was part of the concentration camp, and he was a Jew. They were both Jews, and they were just having a discussion. And as the train was just going, the guy took a risk and jumped on one of the carriage as it was speeding up at full flight. And he managed to escape by getting out of the concentration camp into a carriage. And he must have travelled to, I don't remember the after details, but I just remember just opening my mouth, like literally speaking, just opening my mouth and going, oh my gosh, like that actually, he actually sought safety that way. And that's one of the reasons why we don't want to endorse a fascist government. We don't want people to be trapped. We don't want people to be isolated. Similar to asylum seekers in Manus Island. I mean, it's not a concentration camp, but at the same time, it's been deemed illegal. So therefore, how is Australia going to be presented as a humane country when Manus Island is deemed illegal? Sure, it's in Papua New Guinea, but it's, Australia has a large say in whether we can, bring in asylum seekers. And one of the points you raised before about, eloquent speakers, Adolf Hitler was a good speaker. If you look at some of the YouTube videos that are out there of him, he just seems to gather support because he's very charismatic. He has that intelligence about him when it comes to public speaking. And public speaking is an art form in itself. I think it's still relevant to date. If you're not good at public speaking and you're Prime Minister, President of the United States, you're pretty much screwed, to put it bluntly. Yeah. Because if you don't master the art of public speaking, then it's hard to gather support from anyone, even if you're invested in politics, perhaps. Someone like Tony Abbott would speak quite, slowly, and there didn't seem to be any rhythm when he was talking. Whereas I can look at someone like Obama and listen to him, and probably listen to him for over 20 minutes than I could with Abbott. I might switch off for 5 because I just feel it's too slow. Not from a policy sort of thing, just the way they're speaking.
Mm.
So, like you said, it's interesting when people have that apathy concerning politics, how the public speaking of that politician can influence party members. I think can go underrated sometimes. We talk about the policies itself, just what gets politicians elected. Support, and support comes from advertising. Sometimes it's rightly used, sometimes it's misled. Donald Trump, of course, is a prime example of that. Just his charisma. Not comparing them to Adolf Hitler, but just comparing that, they're good at public speaking.
Yeah.
Either way you look at it, if you don't endorse policies, I mean, how else could Donald Trump have got to be the? How else could have Trump become the leading Republican nominee if he didn't have good public speaking skills? Because he can't just be a businessman and not have good public speaking skills. You won't be elected. There's a limited array of options, especially in America. You can't vote for Obama. You can vote for Hillary Clinton. There's a lot of stuff about her, though, regarding corruption and lies. Some of those allegations have proven to be false. I don't know if you're aware of any of those allegations.
Not all of them.
I think those allegations have been cleared. It wasn't just concerning Hillary herself. It was also concerning her husband, Bill Clinton, who was the previous president of America. So there's a limited array of options, but one would think that if you had a choice, you would pick Hillary because she has that experience in the American political system, whereas I don't think Trump has really any. So, and that's why I really wanted to stay. I really wanted Obama to stay on. The limited array of options in America is striking, really. Especially because we've become accustomed to Obama for a decade. So
that's been a decade, hasn't it?
Yeah, getting used to another country is just getting used to another leader. Sorry, is just a different thought altogether. And America has a huge influence over, Australia, over England, because they're when you're talking about national security. I mean, we have an alliance with America, so. Could we imagine, Donald Trump, having a meeting with Malcolm Turnbull over policy matters? I mean, I can't just see that happening. I don't want to believe it either. It's just a worrying position to be in. Do you think Trump will eventually end up winning because of his public speaking skills and advertising, or do you think that the American public will see some sort of sense?
Well, it's really terrifying, but I can easily imagine him getting in. It's exactly like I was saying before. He does the exact same thing that Blair Cottrell does. It's taking the normal people in society who are vulnerable. It's a capitalist society. We're all vulnerable unless you're already rich. And misdirecting that fear. It's kind of like a magician, like they try and hide the fact that it's them themselves that create that instability for us. We'd be safe if not for, a ruling class sort of keeping us under the thumb. But we don't all realize that because they're so good at people like Donald Trump and Blair Cottrell. They can be so good at, making that flashy movement and making you think that the reason that you're insecure is because of Mexicans, And
that was a bizarre comment, wasn't it? That Trump made. I want Mexicans to, stay out of our wall, or whatever the comment was. It was slightly racist, to put it simply.
Yeah.
But like with that charisma, I mean, you can get followers, you can get people to support not just yourself, but the party at large. When I think of Donald Trump, I think of him as Donald Trump. I don't think of him as a leading party member or a representative of the party. I just see him as a huge public figure, which has just taken over just the whole media landscape all over the world. The fact that a businessman can actually become the prime minister, which is fine, but whether he actually has the credentials is questionable on my part. But makes me question, like, what are we seeing that we're not seeing? Because obviously he has a lot of votes. So one would think it could be a public speaking thing, but maybe he's made some good policies that he could implement. So just looking on the internet here. So it's even said that Trump has made contributions to campaign of both Republican Party and Democratic Party candidates. So he hasn't just supported the Republican Party solely. He's also supported other politicians in a campaign form. So it's just interesting because when I think of Donald Trump, I think of that TV show that he did when he was like one of the judges or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you know what that was called?
Oh, what is it called? I'm drawing a blank. Why don't I remember this? It's going to keep me up at night.
The Apprentice.
The Apprentice, that's the one.
Yeah. So that's how I first saw Donald Trump, just like in that apprentice role. So to see him, and he was also involved in the WWE as well.
Yeah,
at
that's
WrestleMania.
when I first saw him. Yeah,
with Vince McMahon, and he shaved Vince McMahon's hair off.
Yeah,
in the WWE. That was crazy. So just to imagine that sort of figure, entertainment figure, take over the presidency of the United States, that has to be concerning. That you can have that someone who hasn't got the credentials as some of the other politicians, like a Hillary Clinton, or like an Obama has. So it's just come through, positive, public speaking skills, perhaps some wise policy decisions if he were to be implemented as president. So there's a lot of ways to look at this, and I'm still of the view though that Obama should serve out another term. He hasn't really put a foot wrong, especially with some of the latest policies he's implemented. I mean, one of the things I look at America is the gun legislature and how that hasn't really been corrected even after all those shootings. One thing though that presents itself here is that some terrorism acts are now more individualized, so they're harder to pinpoint by security intel. And I mean, that's a scary proposition in of itself, the fact that, they don't need, large groups to attack someone. It can just be a couple of people.
Yeah, that's something that's really interesting, because you see a lot of sort of homegrown terrorist acts that get committed even here. So talking about weapon control is definitely something that's important. But something that kind of gets glossed over in the media is terrorism is only called terrorism when it's carried out by, a brown person or a Muslim. But we've had pretty much the same sort of incidents happen from, the right-wing spectrum. And it's just been called, weapons charges. So before the rally in Melton, the day before the rally, one of the fascist members with the UPF, Phil Galea, his house got raided the day before the rally, and they found over 10 grams of mercury, a number of stun guns, materials to make explosives, and he was given, I think, like 6 months in jail, or 5 months, and like a small fine. And then apparently the charges got dropped later as well. And, you know, to think that if his house hadn't been raided, just if those 24 hours had gone without a raid, I could potentially have died at that rally at the hands of, you know, some far right-wing individual. And to think that that just gets treated so lightly, but to think what would have happened if a Muslim had been found with the exact same things in his house, he probably would have been deported or given a massive jail sentence, and it would have been terrorism charges. So, yeah, it's really odd to look at that double standard in our society. We're so sort of on high alert on Islamist attacks that we kind of just let every other attack go under the radar.
Yeah, and I also look at the fact that, you know, what can political parties actually do? I mean, Obama, even though he's in power, he's in a position where he's trying to change the laws, but he can't because it's just part of the Constitution, and it's also part of the fact that, you know, America's politicians are quite conservative at the moment regarding, you know, the gun legislature laws. You know, in Australia, of course, you know, if we had something like that, you could carry guns around. I mean, it'd be a bit silly if you could imagine. I mean, it'd be kind of scary as well to witness that here in Australia. But Jude, I'd just like to say thank you for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure to have you on to talk about all things politics, both in Australia and America. Let's hope that Trump is not elected as the American president. Otherwise, who knows what will happen. If he was elected president of America, he can't do anything too out of the ordinary.
Well, actually, yeah, like that's something that I've been saying for a while. Back when Ted Cruz was, you know, a fairly big running candidate, was that Ted Cruz is actually probably more of a threat than Donald Trump, because Trump is so much more openly, radically problematic that it kind of makes him less problematic, because most of the ridiculous ideas he's got would be blocked by Congress. But you get someone like Ted Cruz with a much subtler approach to still being the same sort of thing, and they might actually do some pretty large damage.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think if Trump gets elected, we're probably relatively safe.
Yeah, you would think so. Because like you said, yeah, the Congress would have as much power as he would in terms of the implementation of the policies, and that's what it comes down to. If I was in America, I'd vote for Hillary just because of her experience in the White House. But you never know, and it looks like Trump at the moment, statistically speaking, could become the next president of the United States. And so with that, make sure you try and vote at the federal election. It's always a good thing to vote for a party that you like, you support, and participate in the democratic process. And I know a lot of the SYN listeners are young as well, so it's my first time voting in the federal election. Is it yours?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite exciting.
Yeah.
But so thank you for listening.
See ya.